Every single one of the sacrifices points us to some aspect of how Jesus Christ saves us. Jesus deals with our guilt. Jesus pays our ransom and our debt. Jesus heals the relationships. So every one of the sacrifices points to an aspect of a wonderful salvation we have in Jesus. And of course, Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice, because it's the way all sins are forgiven forever. By one sacrifice, our sins are forgiven forever. Hi, this is a series discovering the gospel in every book of the Bible. And now we come to the book of Leviticus. And there are many, many, many people who said, I'm going to read right through the Bible. And they start in Genesis and never get past Leviticus. Because Leviticus is one of the strangest books of the Bible. What is it about? It's about holiness. And it's about, especially for us, it's a rather strange. It is about how God laid out the rules so that the Israelites could be holy and therefore they could worship and come into his presence. Now, what we're going to do each time we do this, is first of all look and see, how does this book move the storyline of the Bible forward? Secondly, how does this book actually tell us something about the gospel principles of salvation by grace? And thirdly, how does it actually show us Jesus? Let's talk about it like this. First of all, the book of Leviticus actually does move the storyline along. It partly does that by showing us that holiness was something absolutely required. That even though God was a God of grace, and he overlooks our sin constantly, and he forgives us for our sin constantly, that does not mean he says, you can live any way you want. It moves the storyline along because it goes down into great detail on the temple and the tabernacle, the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrifices, all of which are pointing forward to the salvation of Christ. And what this means, of course, is that the book of Leviticus, in some ways, is an extension of the end of Exodus. And so they're moving from the state in which the children of God, the people of God, were just a family into being a nation state and also having a prescribed worship that pointed forward to the salvation that Jesus Christ was going to give. How does this actually, though, show us, if anything, gospel principles? I've had many people say, well, Leviticus is just rules and rules and rules. So many rules. How in the world does that actually show us grace? It seems like the most legalistic book anybody's ever read. And let's not miss the forest for the trees. One of the reasons why the rules are there, things you can't touch, things you can't eat, things you can't do, places you can't go. There was a practical aspect to this, and I'll just be very brief. Most Old Testament scholars say the practical aspect was for the Jews to stick with all the dietary laws and the clothing laws and all these laws that made them holy, was a way of setting them apart from the other nations around them, so that they were able to keep their culture and not become polluted with the idolatries around them. And it's very important to see that the word holy does not just mean what you and I tend to mean, which is very moral. No, literally, the Hebrew word for holy means set apart. And you won't understand the word holy unless you realize that pots and utensils in the tabernacle could be called holy. You say, how could they be holy? Because they're moral? No, because they're set apart for the use of God. They're set apart. They are holy for God. They're dedicated to God. To be holy does mean, of course, a holy person is someone who's obeying the law of God, of course. But holiness is not just compliance to rules. Holiness is being wholly dedicated. It's dedicating your life and doing everything, not for you and not for other people, but for God himself. And the reason why there's all these laws around Israel that, by the way, Jesus himself said this isn't true for Christian followers, they don't have to follow them today, was at that time in redemptive history, at that time in the storyline of the Bible, it was critical for the Jews to stay separate so that they, again, were not syncretists. They didn't bring in all kinds of non-believing and pagan ideas into their culture. The other way, though, so on the one hand, you might say the holiness really shows a gospel principle, and that is that we're supposed to be dedicated to God, totally dedicated. The response to grace, getting out of Egypt, should be total dedication. But here's the other way in which I think the book of Leviticus actually speaks to the need for the gospel of grace. When you read through the book of Leviticus, you immediately realize there's no way anybody can do all this. Nobody's going to be able to do this. There's too much. And it's, in some ways, Leviticus, it's a way for Leviticus to say what is said elsewhere in the Bible, which is there's no one without sin. There is no one, no matter how hard you try, no one is without sin. And therefore, you are going to need grace. But here's the last thing to say. When it comes to how Leviticus points us to Christ, it is not that difficult, especially if you read the book of Hebrews. If you want to know how the gospel, how Jesus is, seen in Leviticus, just go read Hebrews. Every one of the sacrifices points us to Jesus. There's the original, the burnt offering, which deals with our sin as guilt. There's the sin offering. If you read these very carefully, it deals with the fact that our sin disrupts relationships. Every single one of the sacrifices points us to some aspect of how Jesus Christ saves us. Jesus deals with our guilt. Jesus pays our ransom and our debt. Jesus heals the relationships. So every one of the sacrifices points to an aspect of a wonderful salvation we have in Jesus. And of course, Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice, because it's the way all sins are forgiven forever. By one sacrifice, our sins are forgiven forever. Secondly, Jesus is the true priest, because on the one hand, he's the one who opens the way to God. He's the mediator. But it's also true that he's merciful and understanding, because he's the God who became a human being, and so he knows exactly how we feel. And we can go to him like to a merciful, sympathetic high priest with our problems. Lastly, Jesus isn't just the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate priest. He's actually the temple or tabernacle itself, which was a place where you could meet God. And let me end with an interesting story. Dick Lucas, who used to teach at St. Helens Bishopsgate in London, right downtown London, for many, many years. I once heard him do this story. I'm sure he got it from somebody else. But here's what he said. He said, imagine, we cannot imagine how weird Christianity was to the Greeks and Romans, the people who, the society in which the early church lived. We cannot really imagine just how weird Christianity was. And he said, imagine a Christian talking to a neighbor, and the neighbor realizes, oh, a pagan neighbor says, oh, this guy's a Christian. And so the pagan neighbor says, trying to be friendly, he says, well, that's interesting. You're a Christian. So where's your temple? Where are your Christian temples? And the Christian says, well, we don't have any temples. Jesus is our temple. He's the way in which we relate to God. Oh, no temples, says your neighbor. Well then, but where do your priests work? And of course, the early Christian would have said, well, we don't have any priests. Jesus is our priest. Whoa, says the neighbor. What? I said, well, then, if you don't have any temple, you don't have any priests, where are the sacrifices offered? And the Christian neighbor would say, well, we don't have any sacrifices. We don't do sacrifices because Jesus is our sacrifice. And the pagan neighbor would say, what kind of religion is this? And Dick Lucas ends his story saying, there is a sense in which, of course, Christianity really isn't like any other kind of religion. It really isn't. Of course, it's a religion in one sense, but in another sense, it's so different than the other religions. It's understanding of Jesus being the final temple, he's not just a teacher who tells us how to get to God. He brings us to God. He's God come to get us. And therefore, Leviticus points to the fact that we are weird. We are really weird. The Leviticus is a very weird book. Christianity is a very weird faith, but it's wonderful. So that's discovering the gospel in the book of Leviticus. Thank you for being here, and goodbye.